Our modern Parliament contains the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The Lords is a throwback to Magna Carta. The Great Charter gave the barons the right to give the king advice. But what about the Commons?
Well, as the name suggests, it's not noblemen who sit in the House of Commons, but commoners, which means people who aren't of noble birth. So when did commoners first get to sit in this, the greatest council in the land?
Well, the answer is that commoners first entered Parliament in the century after Magna Carta, in the reigns of Henry III and, most importantly, Edward I. And the reason Edward brought commoners into Parliament was that he needed the people of England on his side to help pay for his wars. War was a constant in medieval life. Edward conquered Wales and tried to conquer Scotland. His heirs spent a century at war with the kings of France, the 100 Years' War. That's what these people are reenacting here.
War is costly, not just in terms of human life, but literally costly. The war horses, the weapons, the armor, mail shirts for the foot soldiers, arrows for the bowmen. Kings of England needed cash to pay for all this.
Much of the cost of war was met by the barons, as it always had been in the days of the Norman kings. Soldiers still served in the colours of their local lord. But the cost of war had soared. And since Magna Carta, kings had found it harder and harder to squeeze the barons for more.
And so they had to raise taxes, to pass the burden onto the people of England. But for that, they needed their consent. They needed the people on their side.
So who were the people kings looked to fund their wars? To answer that question, I've come to Stokesay Castle in Shropshire.
This place wasn't built by some rampaging baron. This land was bought in the reign of Edward I by a man called Lawrence of Ludlow, and he was a wool merchant. He'd made his money in trade. So for the first time, we've got people in England with property, with influence, who weren't of noble blood. Lawrence built the Great Hall, and he got a license from the king to add those crenellations, those castle-like defences to the tower. Not that he needed defending. He wasn't at war, but it was the upmarket thing to do. He was basically just showing off.
Across 13th century England, a new class had emerged. The knights and squires of the countryside. Some, like Lawrence, had made their money in trade and farming. Others were descended from the knights and squires of the conquest. Now they lived in manor houses in the countryside. They'd intermarried with Saxon women till the distinction between Norman and Saxon was blurred. Local peasants worked their lands. They had status, influence, cash. And it was these men Edward I wanted to help pay for his wars.
I'll give you an example. The year is 1290, and Edward needed £116,000 to complete his conquest of Wales, a fortune in those days. And so he called a parliament. But first, he just called the Lords. And from April until July, they sat in Westminster advising the king and debating this and that, but they failed to debate the one thing he really wanted, the money for his little Welsh war. And so Edward called to Westminster the Commons of the realm. The knights and the squires and the justices of the peace and the burgesses and the mayors of the towns and the leading merchants, men like Lawrence of Ludlow. And they came to London, frankly, flattered to be involved in the process of government.
The king dressed up his need for money as a kind of patriotic crusade, putting the Welsh in their place. And the local gents were all too happy to pass his tax. They were chuffed to be asked. And they trotted home to the shires to explain how everyone should pay their tax with pride. And everyone was happy, except the Welsh.
It wasn't democracy, but it was, to an extent, rule by consent. And people who weren't of noble birth were inside Parliament, giving advice, voting taxes. Yet another small but significant step along the timeline of history.